Let me welcome everybody to what is the first in our series of Conversations in Global Health. I'm John Monahan. I'm the Senior Advisor to President DeGioia for Global Health. My colleague, Maeve McKean, is an adjunct professor here, and she and I are running this program. As you know, it's a one-credit class where we have distinguished speakers over 6 nights this semester. We are incredibly fortunate that our first speaker is Dr. Anthony Fauci. You all have information on his extraordinary biography. We're just thrilled that you're here. Tony has been a friend of Georgetown for so many years, and as all of you know, is somebody that frankly, it's difficult to imagine somebody who's made a greater contribution to global health than Tony has through his work over the years. So we are very fortunate to have him here. Just a little bit about the format. We're rather than have a presentation, we're going to just ask Dr. Fauci some questions. Maeve and I will at the beginning here. About halfway through, we'll turn it over to the students who are enrolled in this class. There's 18 students. So a couple of you are help prepare questions, and so we'll turn to you to start us off. And then at the end, we'll open up questions to the whole audience. This will last a little bit, an hour, maybe a little bit longer. Dr. Fauci has, of course, we didn't know that Dr. Fauci will be getting back, like the rest of us, I suspect, to watch the State of the Union. I assure you we did not know tonight would be the State of the Union when we originally scheduled this. But anyway, we're looking forward to this conversation. So thank you all for coming. This is really exciting. So thank you. So Tony, as we mentioned when we wanted to start this off, we really we've learned over time that students really love to hear what brought people to global health, and it would be terrific if you could just share a little bit of your personal history of where you grew up, where you went to school. Looking back a little, most of the people here are undergrads or just recently out of school. Your path to where you are today, and the kind of schooling you went through, and a little bit of how you got yourself to NIAID almost a little over 30 years ago. I was just trying to be nice.
Be nice. It's first of all, it's good to be here with you this evening. I especially pleased because I always never say no to John, but I was interested in talking to you all because in many respects, just through circumstance, my background is probably not much different than some of you in the room. So where did I come from and how did I get to where I am in 45 seconds? Well, I'm from New York City. In a few minutes of listening to me, you should figure that out for yourself. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. And I went through an entire career of Jesuit education. I went to a Jesuit high school in New York City, Regis High School. And I think that I started to think about, even subconsciously without even realizing it, why I would be involved in global health at a time that I didn't even know what global health was. So there are a couple of lessons in life that you learn, that sometimes stimuli that you get when you're at a certain stage in your life, you don't realize influences you a decade or more later on. So it had a lot to do with the classical training that I got involved in, even though, I'm obviously a physician and a scientist, so I have science interests, but I really got taken up by the humanitarian and the humanity interests and the classics that I took in high school, Greek, Latin, Romance language. I went to, at a time back then, it's interesting, I have to tell you the story because it's unbelievable. When you went to a Jesuit high school, back when I went to a Jesuit high school, the Jesuits told you what college you would go to. So if you were a really smart guy and you wanted to go into pre-med, you would go to Holy Cross because Holy Cross had a very, very good pre-med. So I wanted to go into pre-med, so I went to Holy Cross. But I did not want to relinquish my intense interest in the humanities. So I took a very unusual pre-med course, which is almost oxymoronic in its description. It was called Bachelor of Arts, AB, Greek, classics dash pre-med. So I took Greek, Latin, more credits of philosophy than I took of science. And that's when I started to realize that I had to make a decision in life, because I was a people person. I liked history. I liked the whole idea of global issues, but I wanted to be a physician and a scientist. So I took all of these courses that kept me interested in the humanities, and I took enough courses to get into medical school, and I went to medical school. And then I found out that that's what I wanted to do. But I was not completely clear about what I wanted to do. And you know, if you talk about lessons that you tell younger people, that a lot of what happens to you involves in things that are completely out of your control. I mean, you just need to be alert and make use of the circumstances that you're put into. It was the Vietnam War, and all of us got drafted, and you had the opportunity to either go in the public health service, which would be the NIH, CDC, or the Navy, the Army, or the Air Force. So I put down on my draft thing, I wanted to do infectious diseases, so I put down public health service, which would either be CDC or NIH. My second was Navy, my third was Army, and my fourth was Air Force. And I got into the NIH, so I spent 3 years in a fellowship there. And that's when I started to really get very interested in the relationship between diseases that infect, that preferentially and disparagingly afflict people of poorer areas of the world. And infectious diseases was one of them. Because if you look globally about the diseases that people suffer from that they don't have to, it's mostly poor people who live in circumstances beyond their control. So I took a fellowship in infectious diseases, and I thought I was going in this direction in my career because I was very successful in clinical research and I was making a name for myself. And then all of a sudden something happened that completely changed my life. And that was on the summer of 1981. There was a report in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report from the CDC about 5 gay men from Los Angeles who presented with a very unusual disease, which ultimately turned out to be AIDS. So I made a decision in my life that I've told John about a lot in our discussions. I decided I was going to turn away from what I had been doing for the previous 8 or 9 years, which was very successful in the field of biomedical science, and start admitting what was thought to be only gay men. Clearly, they're not only gay men, but at the time in 1981, I started admitting these young men and studying their disease, and that's when I got involved in HIV/AIDS. Once you get involved in something like AIDS, it's automatically an open door to global health, because this is a disease that is all over the world. And you know, I knew a lot about other diseases, but only when I started to get heavily involved in AIDS, both in the United States and globally, did I realize all of the other problems in global health, from malaria to tuberculosis to neglected tropical diseases. So I went into it thinking I was going to be a physician that was going to practice medicine in New York City, and I wound up here in Washington, D.C. as the head of an infectious disease institute, very deeply involved in global health. But I get back to, and I don't say this because I'm in a Georgetown facility, but it really was my being enamored of the classics and the humanities that got me much, much more interested in people and their problems than in the actual science of medicine. So, you know, full disclosure, I'm a really good doctor, and I know a lot about science, but I'm much, much more interested in what the impact of diseases are on societies. And that's how I got very much involved in what I'm doing now, in what I'll be doing for the next several years, in PEPFAR and the Global Fund and all the other things that I have gotten involved in. So,
Tony, it's an amazing story. So let me try to pick a couple pieces there. Maybe getting back to the Jesuit piece, I understand the classical training and the understanding the science and its broader implications, but also I think I guess if you could speak at all to the Jesuit tradition of social justice
right.
and service that I know certainly characterize Regis and
Right.
Holy Cross, and to what extent I mean, I could be wrong, but my sense is many people get into global health because they try to tie those two threads in their life. It's the science or the discipline or the expertise they bring, but it is about a larger sense of justice and a way to contribute to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I got started getting that from my parents, who were very much that way. They were very uninterested in material things and were always interested in public service type things. But in the Jesuit training, particularly in high school, I mean, the motto of the school it's an all boys school, so it was, excuse me, ladies, but it was men for others, but it really should be people for others. But it was.
I went to one of those too,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I know it.
So it was men for others, and the idea of public service was a given. By public service, you don't necessarily mean official public service, like work for the federal government as a public service, but what you're doing with your life has some benefit for others. And that was just intuitively and built into everything that you did. And it was in high school, and it was, it was a Jesuit tradition of service for others. And I think that was very important. Not everybody picked up on that, and if you didn't pick up on that, that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. But if you do happen to have a propensity to that, that environment really nurtures it very, very much.
So I guess the other question I have is that maybe it was partly the response as you were drafted and you ended up at NIH, but did you know that research would be a central part of your work, or was that something you found only when you got to the lab and saw that side of?
Yeah, well, John, that's a very good question, and you could extend it to a lot of
Sure.
Of issues that we could talk about this evening. But I was sitting exactly in the same situation where you are right now, and I remember when people would come and talk about career development and how they got to where they were. It was kind of totally something I couldn't get my arms around. Like, I'm never going to be in that situation. I don't even know what I want to do next week, much less what I'm going to do 10 or so years from now. And the thing that you learn is that opportunities are put in front of you that really shape very profoundly what you do in your life. So I did not know at the time that I would be going into global health. And it's a stepwise issue of you get into something, you like it, you feel that you're accomplishing something, and then something else comes along. I mean, the idea that the AIDS epidemic dropped in my lap, and I started doing that since 1981, was a total life changer for me. And I just often think, what would I be doing if there was no HIV/AIDS? Because it was one of those things where I completely made a rather draconian decision of changing everything I was doing to study that particular disease.
Well, let's follow up on, I was thinking of a dinner you and I had with our friend Eric Gooseby a couple of years ago in San Francisco, and just by extension, Dr. Gooseby was helped open the first AIDS ward. I'm not even sure it was called AIDS at that time at San Francisco General, but we were talking about the personal. Obviously, there's this huge public health crisis that was presented by HIV, but also an enormous human cost, especially in the years before ARVs, and
Right.
We both remember that, and I know I certainly didn't see. I knew friends who died, and it's an extraordinarily horrible thing.
Right.
I guess maybe if you could speak a little bit to what you're experiencing, because you were seeing some of the very earliest patients where people didn't even have a clue what was happening.
Yeah.
How that felt as a physician.
Yeah, it was particularly jarring for me because in the 8 years, I did the typical medical training. I went to medical school. I did an internship. I did a couple of years of residency. I did 3 years of fellowship in infectious diseases. And then I went back to the New York hospital to do a chief residency in medicine. So I have a lot of clinical training in medicine. And I got involved in some inflammatory type diseases that were very serious with a high morbidity and mortality. And at a very young age, probably more so because my mentor gave me the opportunity to study these patients, that I made a pretty important impact on I developed therapies that were life-saving. So I went about 8 or 9 years being used to having people with terrible diseases that I would give them this therapy that I developed, which was a very aggressive immunosuppressive therapy for autoinflammatory diseases, and they would get better. So people who otherwise would die were getting better. So I was really on a roll. I said, wow, this is really great. Everybody that comes in thinks they're going to die. I make them better, and all of a sudden, I'm a hero. And then in 1981, when I made the decision to put that aside because I saw something about HIV that and I still can't explain it 37 years later, exactly why I did it. But I said, I don't really want to do this. I want to admit these people and find out what the heck is going on with them, because it was a disease that was lethal. It was attacking at the time only gay men, and we had no idea what it was and was killing everybody. And in medicine, that's a really unusual situation to be in. That's really unprecedented. You don't see that. People can go through multiple generations of physicians, and they're not going to see a disease that's a total mystery, no cause, killing everybody, and selectively infecting only a certain demographic group. So I got fascinated by that, and I got very, very much involved. And we wanted to do studies, but you can't do much study if you don't know what the hell you're dealing with. So it was mostly observational studies, trying to learn just by observing what was going on with this disease. And it wasn't until 1983, when the virus was discovered, that we could actually start doing something. But during that period of time, from the 1981 through the 1980s, before we had any therapy, the first therapy was in 1987, and that wasn't particularly good because it was a single drug with an RNA virus that mutates pretty easily. But during that period of time, I admitted hundreds and hundreds of patients on my ward at the NIH. And I went through the most unusual experience of living a nightmare. I mean, living the darkest years you could possibly imagine, where almost everybody died. Some did not, but they were like 1 out of every 75 people. And it was a terrible, frightening death among people who were disenfranchised, who sometimes their family didn't want to see them because they first found out they were gay, much less the fact that they're dying. I mean, it was really a very, very tough situation. So that, I went from, 9 years of thinking I was a hotshot because I was saving everybody to more than 10 years of watching everybody die and really not having anything to do about it. So that was a very, very unusual experience to me, and it really changed my life, actually.
Well, and as much as you were there in those the darkest days, if you will, you were also there with the introduction of ARVs, and then what's also amazing is you were there at the creation of PEPFAR.
Right.
And so the NIAID obviously funded a lot of the research that led to the domestic response, and then being a leader in the global response. I mean, maybe if you could just expand a little bit. I mean, you played such a key role in both responses.
So what happened when the virus was discovered in 1983 and proven to be the cause in 1984, we started developing drugs over years. And over a period of time until around 1996, we had drugs, but they weren't like drugs that were showstoppers, where they would completely suppress the virus to make somebody essentially lead a normal life. Then from 1996 on, when we had the triple combinations of drugs, we saw what we used to call the Lazarus Effect. I mean, people who were essentially in hospice were getting up and leaving, and then individuals being treated early so that they never got sick. Early on, you only treated somebody when they were really, really in dire straits. Then we realized you could treat someone who's infected and prevent them from ever getting sick. So you could be infected and not get sick. So we did that for a number of years, starting in 1996, 7, 8, 9. And then with regard to PEPFAR, it was one of those things that I feel totally privileged and lucky to have been a part of it. But it was very clear that in the United States, we were completely turning around the epidemic because people were just not dying. And they were not even getting sick. And then when you looked beyond the United States, you realized that 90% of the infections are in the developing world and 67% of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. And the problem is that in sub-Saharan Africa, they had no possibility whatsoever of getting drugs because they were very complicated regimens and they were very, very expensive. And then something happened that was just, absolutely wonderful, is that in 2002, a variety of reasons why. I got to know very well President George W. Bush for a number of reasons. I knew him when his father was president, and I got involved after 9/11 to help develop a biodefense program after the anthrax attacks of 9/11. Some of you may not even know or remember about the anthrax attacks of 9/11. But I got to be very close with the president. And in the spring of 2002, he said to me, his exact words, that I meaning I, the President of the United States, feel that we as Americans have a moral obligation. If we have drugs that can save our lives because we're a rich country, we've really got to see if we can do something about getting those drugs, getting prevention, and getting care to individuals who, because of where they live, that they don't have any opportunity or access to that. So he sent me to Africa to determine the feasibility of whether or not we would be able to bring this highly sophisticated way of treating people, namely antiretroviral drugs, prevention, to a population that had never seen anything like that. Was it possible? There were many people in Washington, some well-meaning people, who actually said that was impossible and we'd be wasting our money to make an investment to try and treat and prevent infection in Africa, even though in some countries the prevalence of infection was 12, 15, 20, 25%. Pregnant women, it was 40%. The military was 45%. Africa was sinking. Southern Africa was sinking from HIV/AIDS. So we said, go and see if it's possible. And I said, well, you know, if I do that, it is not going to be inexpensive. This is going to be something that's phenomenally expensive. And to his great credit, he said, let me worry about the money. Just go and find out if we could do something that's has a transforming impact and that's accountable. I want it to be bilateral. I want it to be able to be something that we don't have to worry about getting ripped off by people who are, you know, essentially using this as an excuse to make money. So I went to multiple countries in Africa and I spent some time there and figured out that, as a matter of fact, the people there were as willing and able to be treated and have prevention of infection as we were here. So I came back to Washington in April, May, and I presented it to the president. I first started a very small program, namely mother-to-child transmission, because we had a drug that would be able to prevent a mother from giving the baby HIV if she were pregnant and infected. And it was a single pill called nevirapine. So I went there and I said, you know, for about $500 million, we could probably prevent infection from mother to child in a pretty good way. He said, that's great. So we started the mother-to-child transmission prevention. And then I thought it was over. Well, thank you, it was great. As I was walking out of the Roosevelt room in the White House, he stopped me and he said, you know, why don't we make this something really much, much bigger? So go back and put together a plan of something that would be completely transforming for Africa. I thought he was kidding. And he introduced me to his deputy chief of staff, who was Josh Bolton at the time, and said, work with Josh and do it. So we spent about 8 months putting together a model. How can we get 50% of all the infected people in the world in the program? What country should we get? Should we include India or not? China or not? Russia or not? What African countries? What Caribbean countries? So about 8 months of my life going back and forth to the White House doing that, we finally came up with a plan that I proposed would be about $15 billion over 5 years. I worked with a guy named Mark Dybel, who's, I hope some of you know. Mark, believe it or not, was my fellow at the time and then became my assistant. And
Mark will be with us later this semester.
So Mark was invaluable to putting this together with me because I couldn't do it all alone. I mean, I was doing it all alone for about 2 months, and then I was just, you know, going on 2 hours of sleep a night. So I said, Mark, I need your help. And he was phenomenal. He ultimately turned out to be one of the ambassadors in charge of the PEPFAR program. So have hope. When your boss tells you, can you help me out? You never know where you're going to wind up. And as it turned out, the president actually approved it. And in the State of the Union address, tonight's State of the Union, the State of the Union address, he announced the PEPFAR program. And it has turned out now to be the most important public health endeavor for a single disease in the history of civilization, actually. And that is its truth. That's not hyperbole. I mean, we have now about 15 million people on PEPFAR alone have been on therapy. Millions of babies would have been infected if it were not for PEPFAR. And it also cares and prevents, so it's an amazing program. The lesson is that when the leadership of a nation in the form of a president wants to do something with a great impact, it can be done. And I think that that's going to be his lasting legacy. Think what you want about any other aspect of his presidency, but PEPFAR was something that was amazing. Yeah.
I think there's no question that it will be central to President Bush's legacy. And I have to ask, you've had the opportunity to work with multiple presidents, but obviously President Bush felt something deep there. I know you're not a psychologist here, but it was something he saw, and he had a lot going on in his life at that point. What do you think was the driver, if you would venture a guess, that made him seize this?
I'm positive. I spoke to him about it, and I actually went to Dallas about 6 months ago to celebrate. Mark and I went down there to celebrate the 15th anniversary of PEPFAR in Dallas with him, and we had dinner and we talked about that. And he's the same now as he was back then. To him, it was a moral imperative. I mean, it was absolutely, it was almost indefensible if he didn't do it. He felt, as the president with the power that he has to do this, to not essentially rescue individuals and countries that were really falling apart because of HIV. He felt that it was absolutely his responsibility as president and his moral obligation as a human being. No doubt.
And that's, and part of the reason I asked that, of course, is that in this current environment, it's really important to remember that people of both parties are motivated by moral imperatives. We may all disagree on really important issues, but I think it is an extraordinary moment that President Bush had. Tony, maybe this is related in the sense that through all this work you've done over the years, in addition to the leadership at NIAID and your work on developing policy, you've also been an incredible communicator about health issues. In fact, one thing that almost everyone I've known says about you is you are the best communicator of complex health issues, of anyone that they know. You make things real and caring without dumbing it down or simplifying the science beyond what it should.
Right.
My guess is that the health professionals of tomorrow are going to have to do even more public communication.
Right.
We're in a world where the speed of communication is increasing rapidly.
Right.
We're in a world where institutions and expertise is challenged. And I think doctors, though, and health professionals are going to be in a tough spot. I guess your reflections on, one, the success you've had in conveying really complicated and important issues, whether it's AIDS. I mean, we forget today, there was a huge debate on whether President Reagan would even reference, for example, HIV and gay people, but we're in a different world now. So I guess one question I have for you is, in you looking back at how you've been communicating over the years, and you think about health professionals of the future, what advice do you have from what you've learned? What works and what doesn't?
Yeah, actually, it's something that I enjoy communicating, and I've made it almost an avocation. But there are a couple of I would say rules or guidelines that I don't even know if I thought about them or if somebody. It's very interesting. I don't know whether I thought about it myself or I heard it from somebody or somebody told me. But I believe that a Jesuit priest, either in high school or college, told me something that I never ever forgot, and it was precision of thought and economy of expression. Be precise in exactly what you're talking about and say it in as few words as you possibly can. So with that as the background, what are some of the Fauci rules of communication and how people, particularly in science, tend to go astray? So if you're trying to communicate something, it's important. There are a couple of things. First of all, you got to know your audience. Because some people, it's kind of like, people who go out onto a baseball field with a basketball uniform on, know what game you're playing, know who your audience is, and make sure you have a message. 10 messages means no message. So if you come and try and give an audience 10 messages, they're going to not go away with anything. So you got to know what your audience is and have a precise message. Probably for a scientist, one of the most important things, or even if you're not a scientist, it has to do with who your audience is that if you're trying to explain something to someone, the important thing is to not show how smart you are. It is to get the person to understand what what you're talking about. And very often, when you get in front of an audience or in front of a congressional committee or in front of a television camera or what have you, you inappropriately, maybe understandably, but inappropriately, try to act like you really know what you're talking about and you're really a smart person. It doesn't matter to the person who's listening to you how smart you are. They only want to understand what the hell you're talking about. And often you see scientists involved in getting very convoluted and arcane, and they get off message. So the other trick is stay on message. If somebody asks you a question, answer the question. Don't give a soliloquy on something else. I often see that when, it could either be in a press conference or in front of a congressional hearing or even in front of a class where somebody asks a question and you go off in 16 different directions. Answer the question, period. And then give the other person a chance to answer.
Speaking of communication, I think they want us to switch the mics.
Okay.
Okay. I think that was okay. Is this good? Yeah. Okay, we're good.
Actually, I think, Maeve, you may have one question that relates to communication here.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm trying to.
Yeah.
Well, one piece is you said sort of in the beginning of your remarks, one of the key issues is access to medicine for impoverished people globally, but one of the key infectious disease issues that we see day to day is this anti-vaccine movement,
Right.
where people with means and access to medication for reasons aren't taking taking the prophylaxis. So I just wanted to hear from you. It seems like it's a communication issue, and what do we as a community, how can we help to protect those vulnerable, mostly children who aren't being vaccinated?
That's a tough one because the anti-vax movement is complicated because a large part of it is predicated on fraudulent and incorrect information. I mean, the most egregious example is that the measles, mumps, rubella, particularly measles, cause autism. So there are some people who, for a variety of reasons, feel that anyone in society telling them what they should be doing with their children is something that they're going to reflexly back off against. And what they're doing is looking for a reason for that. And that's when they start believing that this vaccine causes autism, and when you give 5 vaccinations in a year, you're overloading the immune system, causing a variety of other things, all of which has been extraordinarily clearly proven to be not the case. But once you latch on to feeling you don't want to be told what to do, then you get into the propagation of this misinformation. So my approach has been, and I've had to deal with it, it's uncomfortable because it's wearing on you, I can tell you. I just gave a half an hour interview on C-SPAN this morning at 9 o'clock on anti-vaccine movement, and it had a call-in session, so you could imagine who was calling in. Yeah, your uncle, right? Your uncle. He should have told me he was your uncle. But the way you can approach that is that I never ever denigrate or attack the people who are anti-vaxxers, because all that will do is certainly turn them off to even listening to anything you have to say, and assume that you're attacking them, therefore you don't know what you're talking about, so you're resorting to an ad hominem. So I know that there will be a certain fraction of people, no matter what you say or what you do, they are still going to be anti-vaxxers. But there's a substantial proportion of people who, if you give them the evidence and talk to them in a measured way about the facts, then you can win many of them over. You're not going to win the recalcitrant ones that no matter what happens, they're not going to be agreeing to it. And also you can appeal somewhat to the community responsibility of people. People don't really understand that with measles, and that's what I explained on the C-SPAN this morning, that measles is one of the most contagious diseases known to man. If you have a room full of, if all of you are not immune to measles, you didn't get vaccinated for one reason or other, and I have a child that comes into this room, and starts sneezing and coughing and has measles, 90% of you will get infected. There's no other infectious disease in the world that has a 90% attack rate. 90% of you would be infected. On the other side of the coin, the measles vaccine is one of the most effective vaccines in the history of vaccinology. It's 97 to 98% effective. So it seems so paradoxical that on the one hand, you got one of the most infectious agents known. On the other hand, you have one of the best vaccines, and then you have people who have a problem with taking the vaccine. In society, if you go below 92, 91%, maybe 90% of the people who are vaccinated, the issue of herd immunity disappears. In other words, it allows an outbreak to occur. And that usually is in populations that are relatively secluded, where the percentage of the cohort that's unvaccinated goes down to 80, 70, 60%. That's a recipe for a disaster. That's a disaster waiting to happen. That's what happened a couple of months ago in New York City and Brooklyn with the Hasidic Jewish community, who had a very low rate of vaccination. And then when someone came from Israel, where they don't vaccinate them very much, came over here, had measles, gave it to the entire community. There's an outbreak now in Clark County in the state of Washington, the same thing. So I try to appeal to the community spirit. I try to give them as much information, factual information, evidence-based information, and I never ever attack them, because if you do, then you're going to lose the game.
That's really helpful advice. And so I think that's a good time for us to transition now from our conversation. Unless maybe you got well, I would think so now what, just as a reminder, we've got 18 students enrolled in the class, and for each one of our sessions, 2 or 3 students take the lead in providing briefings and questions. So I'm going to call on Patrick Walsh and then Margaret Chappell to ask questions, then we'll turn it over to a larger group. So Patrick?
Yeah, so my name is Patrick. Hello. My question kind of relates to a lot of kind of your history and your experience. You've been in this role for the last 35 years or so. And right now, like in growing up right now, I've seen kind of the Ebola outbreaks, Zika outbreaks, H1N1, H5N1. My question would kind of be, from these recent outbreaks, what are kind of lessons and challenges that can be kind of extrapolated and applied to future crises?
No, that's an excellent question. One of them is really simple, and that is, we know that outbreaks occur. The idea that outbreaks are some nebulous things that may or may not happen. Outbreaks occur. Pandemics occur. Pandemics of influenza, outbreaks of Ebola, outbreaks of Zika, outbreaks of other things. We know they occur. So what we have been doing over the last, I would say more than 10 years, probably 15 to 20 years, is to get out of the reactive mode and do what we call, and I'm sure you've heard it maybe in a class, what we call pandemic preparedness. So pandemic preparedness is different from pandemic reactivity, where you react to the pandemic as opposed to prepare for the pandemic. And that has to do with developing vaccine platforms that are easily implementable. That's the idea of what we call priority pathogens, to be able to anticipate what in fact might be, but not put all your eggs in one basket, and talk about prototype pathogens. So for example, the reason we were able to respond so rapidly to Zika is that Zika is a flavivirus. We've had multiple experience with other flaviviruses in how you develop vaccines, how you develop interventions. I mean, there's Japanese encephalitis, there's yellow fever, there's a whole variety of other flaviviruses, so we use from that experience. So there's this whole new strategy called pandemic preparedness that we didn't have years ago. It was always wait around for something to happen and then respond as quickly as you can. Now, a lot of stuff is preemptive, particularly in developing easily adaptable vaccine platforms and diagnostic multiplex platforms.
Hi, I'm Margaret. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the partnerships that were formed between the U.S. and the benefiting countries, PEPFAR. Specifically, it seems like those relationships were really important in the success of
Right.
PEPFAR so far. I'm curious to know how the U.S. was able to develop those bilateral partnerships and make sure that other countries were accountable and that you were having that positive relationship.
Yeah, and I think you used a word that explains everything, in that it was a partnership with them, not parachute science where you drop in, you do something, you write a paper, and you leave, which was unfortunately a lot of what happened decades ago. So it was very clear, like, we have an extraordinary partnership in South Africa, where the South African investigators are really the leaders in the PEPFAR movement. We're giving them the PEPFAR resources. We've helped build, with PEPFAR money, infrastructure, but it isn't like we are the ones that are doing it. It's that you are the ones that are doing it, and we're helping you to get your wheels off the ground. And once you do, then you've got to do it on your own. So it was clearly not necessarily a donor country, but a partner country. And that's the most important reason why it's worked.
Excellent. So maybe I open it up to questions from anyone else in the class who's enrolled. Anybody? Arms, hands? And so, Patrick, if you wouldn't mind being the MC, that would be great. Thank you. And if you just give your name and what program you're in, that would be terrific.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Lizzie Zachary, and I'm a grad student in the biology program. Something I was wondering, since you've had a lot of experience working on delicate issues, is what has been the biggest professional moral dilemma you've faced, and how did you eventually come to a decision?
Wow.
It's a Jesuit university.
Well, I don't know if it was a moral dilemma, but there are probably a couple of examples. But one of the situations that we faced when we were putting PEPFAR together is that it was very, very clear that we needed to have billions of distribution of condoms. And remember, this was in an administration that was, even though the president himself was extraordinary in allowing me to put together the program and to supporting it, there were a lot of people in the administration at the time that would be against everything, condoms, birth control, everything. It looked like we may not actually have been able to distribute billions of condoms, which we wanted to do. There were some individuals who were very conservative who said, in the prevention aspect, 1/3 of it has to be abstinence. You remember that? And I know from my experience that abstinence doesn't work, period. It may work for 1 out of however many people, but as a public health measure, abstinence doesn't work. So we had to come to an agreement that they would give in on the condoms, and I would give in saying, okay, 1/3 of the prevention activity would be on essentially preaching abstinence. So my moral dilemma was that I absolutely did not agree that abstinence would be any impact at all on prevention of HIV. It just didn't work, particularly when you're talking with people who don't really have any choice about abstinence. They're in a situation where, particularly when you look at the status of many women in societies that we were dealing with, they almost had no choice about deciding whether they want to have abstinence or not. So I gave in on abstinence so that I could get about 10 billion condoms. So that was my dilemma.
Excellent. Any other, oh, here we go.
Hi, I'm Jolly Marie. I'm a grad student in the Biohazard program. And as you mentioned, public communication is essential for any public health initiative. But what else do you think is necessary for a successful global health initiative?
Well, one of the tough lessons that we learned, not from our own experience, but watching others, is that when you're dealing with a global health issue, you absolutely have to have the host country that you're dealing with as a leader in what you're doing. You can't dictate to them what's good for them in global health. We had that experience very recently with the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, where we wanted to obviously implement some of the programs, but we also wanted to do clinical trials to determine what vaccine worked and what therapy worked. And it could easily have been bringing my team over there and let them do everything. But we didn't do that. We let them do it, even though they didn't do it at first nearly as well as we could have done it. But at the end of the outbreak, they were very experienced in what they were doing, and they're able to do it now on their own without us. So if we had said we wanted to be perfect, and you're not perfect, so let's do it our perfect way, as opposed to saying, let's do it your pretty good way, and then maybe after a few years, you'll do it perfectly. And it worked out great, because right now, the people in Liberia are extremely competent in carrying out a clinical trial. So if there's ever an outbreak again of Ebola in Liberia, which had nothing when we went to Liberia, I mean, there was something like 17 doctors in the entire country. So there are more doctors between 21st and 22nd and K Street than there are in the entire country of Liberia.
All right, so how about we start, I guess, Louisa, and then we get the whole second row here, I guess. So.
Hi, I'm Louisa. I'm with the Global Health undergrad program, and I had a quick question. I know viral sovereignty has become sort of a big issue in the realm of infectious disease, and I was wondering if you had any ideas on how to sort of settle those issues between the countries that are receiving aid and that are experiencing epidemics and the countries that are doing a lot of the research.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the first part. The difference between the countries that are...
So on the topic of viral sovereignty, like how to make sure that countries who are experiencing epidemics are still receiving.
It's the benefit. I think you're getting at the benefit sharing issue. This is like Minister Suharto, the idea, should we have, what's the future of benefit sharing for countries that make viruses available?
Viral sovereignty. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
This is our issue from many years ago.
I mean, that's a really tough issue. I think the idea of a country in which there's an outbreak and you get a viral isolate, it's gone to the other extreme now. Before we used to take the virus, say thank you very much, goodbye, make a vaccine, and they had nothing. They gained nothing out of it. Now they're actually holding back of even giving any information. So I think there needs to be sort of like a golden mean to that, where if you get something from a country, an isolate or what have you, there has to be some benefit for the country. It has to be, whether that benefit is, doing a vaccine trial and making vaccine available to them, sharing the intellectual property, sharing the economic benefit, but you can't just do what we used to do on the outside and just walk away and essentially take what it is in there. The trouble with that is that the rebound against that has made it very, very difficult, because right now countries are actually holding back isolates from us, and that's counterproductive.
So just a quick follow-up. So in your view, is the PIP framework then not as successful as we'd hoped it would have been?
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
Hi, my name is Rachel, and I just wanted to thank you again so much for taking time to come speak to us today. But my question is, in the very beginning, when you were first learning about this outbreak just in the gay male population, I'm really curious, if you faced any resistance among your colleagues to bring in, these men that were highly stigmatized in the culture at that time. Did you have any trouble advocating for them among your colleagues or among people to convince them that this was a huge issue, not just for the gay population, but for the whole U.S.?
Yeah, in the beginning, there was almost preposterous stigma associated with it, and I'll give you some examples. So when I decided that I was going to start bringing in these patients who were really very sick. I mean, it wasn't like you see now where you have an HIV-infected individual. They look as healthy as anybody because they're on appropriate medications. These people were really, really sick. And there was a pushback among some about even admitting them to the wards of the NIH, where people would be coming with a variety of other diseases. So I got, some, I would say, pushback of resentment about what I was doing. It was at a stage in my career that not very many people wanted to mess with me, so it wasn't like I was intimidated by the fact that they didn't like the idea of my bringing people on the ward with that. But there was also a really strange kind of the way people looked at you if you were taking care of an HIV-infected individual, like maybe you are infected and we don't know it, and you're going to get us infected. So diseases, particularly diseases of contagion, even though the contagion is clearly not casual contact, brings out the worst in people, I find. You're asking a question about HIV, and the stigma associated with the patients often spilled over on the people who were taking care of the patients. So, I mean, and also society had a strange viewpoint towards them. Many of my colleagues thought I was crazy giving up a really successful career path to go study this disease among disenfranchised gay people, and it's probably going to go away anyway, which, if you examine that attitude, that's horrible, to say that. But it was that way. It goes beyond AIDS, because in Ebola, I admitted a couple of Ebola patients to the NIH. My goodness, if you talk about them worrying about HIV, you could see what was going on with Ebola. Some people in the community were very concerned about the children of my nurses going to their daycare center because of the wild extrapolation that the nurse could get it from the patient, who would give it to the kid, who would then give it to their children. When we knew scientifically that was impossible to happen, because you don't spread Ebola unless you're really very sick and you got all blood and urine and feces all over you. You don't spread Ebola unless you're in a situation where you're very actively ill. But we had people who wouldn't go near us because we were taking care of an Ebola patient.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm a Biology of Global Health undergraduate. And so I'm just wondering, what risks, I guess, do programs like PEPFAR and the global health field in general, do they face today, perhaps in terms of funding or support? What could we do to keep programs like this happening and successful?
Yeah. Well, obviously, whenever you have areas of fiscal constraint, and there's a lot of economic pressures, as you know, right now, with all of the difficulties we're having in their country, discretionary programs like PEPFAR if they don't have really strong champions, are quite vulnerable in shrinking, and vulnerable for a number of reasons. People misinterpret that, oh, you've been really successful, so now we could move on to something else, as opposed to the fact that PEPFAR is a program that has continuing and even growing needs until you actually turn around the kinetics of the outbreak and each individual country can handle what it is that's their problem in their country. So I get very concerned about the fact that we don't have that kind of enthusiasm for increasing. It's almost, you feel lucky if you weren't cut. That's a strange mindset to get into. It's very, very different from the mindset when we first started the program. So the short answer to your question is that I'm really concerned about that.
Why don't we think about maybe like two more questions here, and then I saw another hand back there. How about the last two hands there, and then we'll.
Hello, I'm Zach Allen. I'm an undergrad student. I study global health. And I just had a question about like modern domestic HIV policy. Specifically, I heard that in San Francisco and New York, they've just started doing like treatment immediately post-screen for HIV patients. And I've heard like that's being brought into Washington, D.C. But also I've been doing some HIV screening volunteer work on the weekends. And like we work in a tent that's not secured, that doesn't have any temperature control. So I was wondering, like, in terms of the future of HIV treatment in Washington, D.C., is that a possibility?
Yeah. You know, there's no way of your knowing or being aware of that, but we started a similar program here in D.C. with the Washington Hospital Center and the Centers for AIDS Research that Alan Greenberg has in D.C. to mimic, to the extent possible, this program that you alluded to called a RAPID program. It's a program that was started in San Francisco that is a phenomenal program. And I think if we can implement that more widely throughout the country, particularly in geographic and demographic hotspots, we're going to go a long way to turning around the epidemic. And the RAPID program is, if you look at what's called a continuum of care, so let's say I'm HIV infected. So I don't know I'm HIV infected. So I get tested, and now I know I'm HIV infected. But then I walk away, and I don't go to the next step, which is to go on therapy. Or if I go on therapy, I don't stay on therapy. Or if I go on therapy, or if I get a prescription, but I don't fill the prescription. Or I fill the prescription, and I don't take the medication. Or I take the medication, but I don't take it often. The continuum of care goes way down so that at every step, you're vulnerable to losing the patient. You lose them because they don't get tested. You lose them because they tested and never came back. You lose them because you gave them a prescription, but they never filled it. You lose it because they filled the prescription, but they never took the medication. So every step makes you more vulnerable. The RAPID program says, we're going to circumvent that. So they have a health force of volunteers that go to where you're likely going to find infected people. Homeless shelters, gay bars, sexually transmitted disease clinics, places like that. And they go in and they test someone, and they don't let them leave until they get the result of the test, because now you could do a saliva test and you can get the result in minutes. So now, let's say you're positive. So I'm not going to say, here's a prescription. I'm going to say, here is a starter pack of drug. Take one of these pills each day, and I'm going to write you a prescription, and I'm going to send you after a month to fill the prescription and go on therapy. And I want you to come back to see me or contact me in 2 weeks. Here's my cell phone number, call me. And they say, well, I'm sorry, I don't have a cell phone. They go into a box and they say, here's a cell phone. And they essentially don't allow them to get out of the continuum of care. And with that, the infection rate is just plummet down. So that's what we really need to do in Washington. We did a bit of it in Washington, but not as nearly as well as they did it in San Francisco. Governor Cuomo in New York State is trying to do in New York State the same thing that they successfully did in San Francisco.
And Tony, do you think it would be possible to do this at scale around the country in the high impact areas? I mean, we know that the current the HIV epidemic, at least in the United States, there seem to be hotspots here, like we've found in Africa and other places. Could it, or is it something that really only makes sense in a handful of big cities?
No. Stay tuned. Stay tuned. Watch television. Read the Journal of the American Medical Association next week. Stay tuned. I can't.
You heard it here first. So it means read, and be sure to read JAMA. But let's. So who? I think we had one more. There's two. There's two here. The first. Oh, please. Yeah. And then the last. You'll be the last one, I think.
Okay. I'll stand up.
Oh.
Dr. Fauci, thank you for chatting with us. My name is Nomazwe, and I'm a third-year medical student. My question is with regard to what you talked to us about, how you sort of found yourself in global health in a sort of happenstance way from your career in medicine. There are global health tracks for residents, and there are fellowships for students who have graduated, but there doesn't seem to be sort of like a definite path to global health from medicine. And so my question is, for that reason, I feel like sometimes it's kind of difficult to figure out what niche clinicians occupy within the field of global health. What would you say is the particular role that clinicians play within global health beyond medical missions?
Well, that's a great question. I think clinicians can play a major role in global health because they come to it with an understanding that not necessarily is better than someone who did a master's in public health or got a PhD in whatever discipline, but you have a different perspective. I mean, you do. And I always say that, worrying that my PhD friends are going to think I'm being elitist, but I'm not. It's just a different perspective. The fact that I, with my own hands, have taken care of desperately ill people with diseases that have global health impact has had a major impact and effect on how I think about global health. Because when I think about global health, I mean, I just flash back to my experiences as a physician. So global health means something to me that it might mean a little bit different to somebody else. So I mean, if you're in medical school, you're gonna be a physician and you wanna go in global health, you're gonna have a lot of opportunities to do that and do it from the standpoint of a physician.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Angelova. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us to start off. Public communication seems to be very crucial in managing epidemics. How do you go about communicating with the public in a way that's factual and yet doesn't cause panic?
Oh, great. Good question. No, it's one of my favorite questions because you all were too young during anthrax and I spent half my life in front of a TV camera during the anthrax attacks because there was such panic about it. When you communicate, see, an outbreak is something that's dynamic. It's evolving. So what you don't know today, you may know tomorrow. And what you learn tomorrow may negate what you thought you knew yesterday. So the area of facts are fluid. So the one thing you really got to do if you're a public health communicator is don't guess, okay? When someone asks you a question, either you know the answer or you don't. And don't ever be afraid of saying, I don't know the answer to that right now. We are trying to get the answer. There is a almost uncontrollable urge, and this gets back to what I was saying about don't try to appear so smart, that if you say you don't know, people are going to think you're incompetent. In the beginning of an outbreak, hardly anybody knows anything, no matter how smart they are. So one of the mistakes we get into is we project and surmise and guess. Well, what do you think? This mutation occur? I mean, a classic example was during the Ebola outbreak when someone wrote a paper that Ebola was mutating. duh, it's an RNA virus. Of course it's mutating. And then someone speculated that if it's mutating, possibly it could mutate and become a respiratory-borne infection. That created this firestorm of disinformation, including an editorial in the New York Times that I spent about 3 weeks trying to essentially turn around. So when outbreaks, only speak about what you know and don't ever be afraid of saying you don't know. That's a rule that'll really put you in good stead.
That seems like a perfect way to end our questions from the audience. Maeve, is there anything you want to add before we say thank you?
No, I don't think I have any particular.
Well, let me first say, Tony, thank you for coming and joining us tonight. It really means a lot to all of us that I know how busy you are, to come and share your experience with our students. And just as a personal friend, I just want to say how much I admire what you've done and what you're continuing to do. It's been a pleasure working with you, and what you've contributed is just extraordinary. And so I'd like to ask everybody here to join me in a round of applause for Dr. Fauci.